Greetings. My name is Jonathan Sarna. I'm the director of the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies, and it is my really great pleasure to welcome you to our program entitled The Moral Triangle: Germans, Israelis, Palestinians, which is co-sponsored with Brandeis University Center for German and European Studies. In a moment, it will be my great privilege to introduce my colleague, Professor Sabine von Mering, who will be the moderator of today's program. But before I disappear, I wanted to remind everyone that at the very bottom of your screen, you will find a chat feature, and please use that for questions. And to the right of the chat feature, you will find closed captioning. If you want to turn that off, just click on it and it should give you that option. And now, without further ado, Professor von Mering.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, and welcome everyone. It's a privilege and a pleasure to be here today and to be joining this important conversation. So we have two guests, and I want to introduce them first. Katharina Galor is the Hirschfeld Associate Professor in Judaic Studies and Urban Studies at Brown University. She specializes in the visual and material culture of Israel-Palestine. Her publications include The Archaeology of Jerusalem from the Origins Through the Ottomans, and that was published in 2013, and in 2017, Finding Jerusalem, Archaeology Between Science and Ideology. And there's a longer biography on our websites if you want to learn more. And Dr. Saed Achan is an assistant professor of peace and conflict studies at Swarthmore College. He is spending the 2020-21 academic year as a visiting professor of anthropology and visiting scholar in Middle Eastern studies at the University of California, Berkeley. He received a PhD in anthropology and Middle Eastern studies from Harvard University. So welcome to you both, and thank you for making time to be with us. We have questions for you, and later Shana will be joining us and also moderate questions from the audience. So let's get right started. This book is quite unusual, co-authored by a Jewish woman and a Palestinian man. And Kati, why don't you start by telling us how did this actually come about? And then Saed, if you could tell us more about the methods and your process, the positionality that you took, and what were some of the challenges in researching, and also what surprised you.
Hey, thank you so much, Sabine. Thank you so much, Jonathan, for this very kind introduction. We're both very excited for this opportunity to talk to you, to engage with you, and thank you also, Shana, for making this happening. And so it's wonderful to be there, even though it would be much better if we could be there in person for some other time, I hope. So I actually met Saed after the tragic summer of 2014, the Gaza war, which we both experienced from two different sides of the border. I, as an Israeli from Jerusalem, and Saed as a Palestinian from the West Bank. And I remember returning to Brown after the summer, and it was a very difficult period, and the first event that Brown organized was a panel on the consequences of the Gaza war. And so I attended the event along with hundreds of others. And there was Saed. He was the most junior of all the panelists. And to me, he stood out among the crowd. and for his wiseness, for his calmness, and for his perspective. And so after the panel, I walked right up to him and I started to talk to him. And then coincidentally, about a week later, a Jewish friend of Saed's, Hannah, and my Palestinian friend Reem were in town, and they were friends, and they decided that they just had to get the two of us together, and they organized a little get together, a little tea party for the four of us. And this is when we hit it off. We became friends. We were, despite our very different national, religious, and even scholarly backgrounds, and we found a lot of common interests. And of course, both of us had already worked on the Israel-Palestine conflict. And so we started to read each other's work, but it was not until 2 years later, when I temporarily moved to Berlin with my husband in 2016, that I had the idea that we should do something together. I had already read about the very significant wave of Israelis coming to Berlin, a really weird phenomenon. I mean, moving into, of all places, to the former Nazi capital. And so this really made a big splash in the media, mostly in the German media and also in the Israeli media. So I knew about it. And I was actually quite excited about finding lots of Israelis in Berlin. And once I settled, I learned about the much larger Palestinian community. And so I thought maybe this would be an opportunity to write a short paper on these two communities in Berlin, but also about their relation with Germans. And so I proposed this to Saed. He had never been to Germany. He had also his own hesitations, informed, I think, by his own Holocaust education at high school. And I somehow managed to convince him. And then for a period of about 2 years, we followed the media coverage in Hebrew, Arabic, German, and English, everything that had to do with those two communities in Berlin. And we, of course, also read all of the scholarly literature on these two communities, the Israeli community in Berlin, or Germany more generally, and the Palestinian community. And so we very quickly came to realize that the subject was far more complex than we originally anticipated. And we also discovered that this topic touched upon a huge taboo. And actually none of the scholarship has brought these two or three communities into dialogue. This was something that had not been done before, and for good reason, because it touches upon a very, very sensitive point. But we felt that there were so many aspects that were very important and that had been silenced for too long. And we felt that we sort of had not only the agency, but also some sort of responsibility to document these issues. And so this was the beginning, so you know that it never came to a paper. It very quickly, all the material that we accumulated very quickly expanded into book-length manuscript.
So I'd love to reiterate Kati's gratitude to all of the organizers and co-sponsors of this event. We're so honored to be able to engage with the Brandeis community. I was deeply moved when Shana mentioned that over 400 people had registered for this event on Zoom. So we're deeply humbled to be with you all, and we look forward to this discussion. And absolutely, everything that Kati just said really resonates very deeply with me. What I'll add is that the central question we asked in our book is, what moral responsibility does Germany have, the state and society, towards Israelis and Palestinians in its borders in the present? And what we found was that among our interviewees, Germans, Israelis, and Palestinians, over 100 of them, equally divided and very representative sample, we found 5 schools of thought. Some who believe that the moral responsibility is to Israelis alone, some to Palestinians alone, some who feel that it's to both, some who feel that there's no responsibility to either community, and also those who are apathetic or indifferent. And so we theorize what we call this moral triangle that connects Germans, Israelis, and Palestinians. And we think we're really poised to be able to explicate these issues, given Kati's German-Israeli background. 90% of her family passed away in the Holocaust, tragically. Kati's father was in Auschwitz. Also, my positionality as a Palestinian who grew up under Israeli military occupation in the West Bank, and our anthropological and archaeological backgrounds that informed our ethnographic research. So we spent lots of time in Berlin, navigating the city, meeting in people's homes, cafes, going to the theater, to the Jewish Film Festival, and so much more. It was an incredibly enriching research project to undertake, and we're very thrilled by the production of our book.
Thank you. I didn't know you hadn't been there before you got engaged in this project, because it certainly felt like you knew very well what you were getting into. I mean, it as someone coming from Germany, it reads very, also very generous. You're very generous to the Berliners that you encountered. So you've already kind of described the project a little bit, but maybe we can go a little bit deeper into the subject, the people you engaged with. So who are they, and what are the differences between them? I know you mentioned that the much larger group of Palestinians in Berlin, comes to Berlin with a very different background, for very different reasons, in very different ways than the Israelis. And maybe we should talk a little bit about what the differences are inside the groups, and how representative they also are of their populations at home, and how they intersect, if at all, also how do they relate to other Arab and Muslim communities in Berlin, like Turkish and Syrian populations, which are, of course, also, and some of them have been there for many decades as well.
Yeah, so maybe I can take care of the first half of the question, and Saed will continue. So there are currently about roughly 25,000 Israelis and about 60,000 Palestinians living in Berlin. And for reasons that are much too complicated and long to explain here, it is actually difficult, if not impossible, to determine the exact numbers. I mean, the estimates range from much less to significantly more. But what we do know for certain is that the Palestinian community is about twice as large, at least twice as large as the Israeli community. But in terms of public visibility, apart from the mostly negative portrayals of Palestinians in the media, which often reference criminal clans, it is actually mostly the Israelis who dominate the public landscape and discourse. The migration to Berlin is also relatively more recent. The majority of the Palestinians came as refugees from Lebanon during the civil war, so that is during the late 1970s and the early 1980s. And this community has really suffered, particularly at the beginning of their arrivals in Germany. There has been a lot of discrimination. And the reason is that the Germans basically hoped if they would treat them really poorly, that is not giving them access to proper housing and to the labor market and to educations, Palestinians would just pack their suitcases and leave Germany, but this didn't happen, of course, because they had nowhere to go. They were refugees and nobody was very eager to have them. And so Germans slowly started to realize that they did not only punish the Palestinians, but themselves as well. And so they changed their policies towards the Palestinians, and that then slowly improved their conditions. And actually over time, they built a lot of capital. There is now a real amazing elite of Palestinian professionals, intellectuals, artists, very successful community now. And so the Israeli community instead is a relatively recent phenomenon, which began roughly 20 years ago. 20 years ago, in the late 1990s, there were about 2,000 Israelis, and now that number has nearly doubled. And it is mostly young and politically and intellectually left-leaning population, so perhaps not so representative of Israelis' majority population. And the draw to move to Berlin, despite the irony of moving to the former Nazi capital, something I already mentioned earlier, the draw is mostly defined by economic advantages, and also to some extent by educational and professional opportunities. And this is not only our finding, other studies have established that as well. So to put it bluntly, the Palestinian community is largely defined by discrimination, not only, but largely, and the Israeli community largely by privilege. There are, of course, exceptions. And while these communities and also their relations with Germany's are pretty different, there are a number of opportunities of intersection. And of course, in fact, for obvious reasons, it is much easier for Israelis and Palestinians to mingle with each other in Berlin than it is in the Middle East. And we do provide a number of examples that are typical for these spaces and initiatives where Israelis and Palestinians come together. For example, in neighborhoods such as Kreuzberg and Neukölln, and some even live together or are in relationships with each other. Some also work together, and mostly within the domain of the arts, visual and performing. We see a lot of joint efforts between Israelis and Palestinians.
I'm happy to take the second part of the question. So Germany does have a significant Muslim minority population, and they have a significant refugee and migrant population, including from the Middle East. And actually, in 2015, nearly 1 million refugees were welcomed into Germany, and migrants mainly from Muslim majority countries, especially Syria, Afghanistan, etc. And this has been controversial in Germany. There are those who welcome these efforts. We talk about the welcoming culture, especially in Berlin, which is such a cosmopolitan city, but there's also xenophobia and discrimination. So the Palestinian German population, the Palestinian community in Berlin, as Kati mentioned, is quite diverse. Many of them are refugees. There's also an elite. There's a Christian minority as well. But overall, they do feel connected to Turkish Germans, to Syrian Germans, to refugees and migrants in Germany. There's often a shared experience of transitioning to a new context, moving to Europe, integration, Islamophobia, anti-Arab racism. There are many, many shared struggles, but there are also distinct parts of the Palestinian German experience, especially given Edward Said's notion, the late Palestinian intellectual who once wrote that Palestinians are the victims of the victims and the refugees of the refugees. So that makes the Palestinian experience, unlike, let's say, the Syrian experience in Berlin, very fraught in certain ways, psychically, psychologically, affectively, because there is that link, directly or indirectly, to this Holocaust memory and the Holocaust commemoration, and where Israelis and Palestinians fit in contemporary German politics and society.
Mm-hmm. So the focus of this triangle, or the center of this triangle, of course, is the Holocaust, and I want to touch on that with a number of questions. One being a smaller question, Kati, that you can probably answer. Non-Ashkenazi Israelis do not have a Holocaust history in their family. So how does that affect them when they are living in Berlin? Do they see it as part of their history?
Well, I would say that pretty much all Israelis are sort of have an exposure or learn intensely about the Holocaust before they come to Germany. It's not only Ashkenazi who learn about the Holocaust. Mizrahi Israelis have just as much of a exposure at school and I mean, all over Israel, you learn about the Holocaust. And this exposure is very often intensified in Germany. There are actually a number of Jewish and Israeli Holocaust experts who have commented on the fact that to some extent Holocaust education in Germany is even more robust than it is in Israel. And so some among our interviewees, Germans, Israelis, and Palestinians, have commented on the awkwardness that all Jews and Israelis, including some Palestinians, of course, with Israeli citizenship, benefit from privileges that are rooted in German compensation, financial and emotional, that the German government and also German society at large extend to Israelis without making this distinction between Ashkenazim and Mizrahim, and without making the distinction whose families were actually affected by the Holocaust and whose weren't, because they're, of course, Ashkenazi Jews who have no connection to the Holocaust.
Mm-hmm.
So the complexity of the issue is perhaps best exemplified by what one of our Israeli interlocutors has shared with us, Omri Ben Yehuda, who actually also wrote about something that touched us very much, and that is actually a very interesting experience. So Omri told us about his reluctance. He, of course, since he published it, we can share this anecdote. So he told us the story about once standing in line to be screened by bouncers at Berlin's most prestigious nightclub, Berghain. And he did not want them to engage in this human selection process, and just left. I mean, he associated, of course, Second World War with Nazi selection, and he felt, I'm not going to let Germans tell me whether I'm fit to enter into the nightclub or not. But he at the same time also told us about his association with his own family experience when migrating to Israel from Morocco. His grandfather, like many others who were too old or sick or handicapped or retarded, were not allowed to migrate to Israel because they couldn't really participate in the Israeli workforce, and so they were left behind. So he had this double association that actually tells a complexity that goes far beyond the association that Germans would expect Israelis to have when they come to Germany.
Thank you. So the connection between the Holocaust and the Nakba was really what I thought your book draws out in a very powerful way. And it was almost a little bit amusing for me as a German at first, that I was like, okay, now we're making the Middle East conflict a German problem. But you're making a very strong case for it. And I want to, Syed, if you could help us tease out the complexities. You know, we want to understand the connection and what we can learn from the connection and what lessons we can derive without equating the two, which is, of course, something that people are, you know, prone to doing if you start going in that direction.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sabina. It's a very insightful question, an important one, and a sensitive one. And we have to be very, very clear that Kati and I do not argue or insinuate in any way in the book that the Holocaust and the Nakba are identical, or even that they can be compared. Our argument is that they should be understood in conversation with one another, given the historical links as well as the intersecting traumas. And I think that a wonderful resource that's since been published since our book is the book of Amos Goldberg and Bashir Bashir called The Holocaust and the Nakba, a new grammar of trauma and history. And they really explicate, I think, another compelling case for why it is that these two historical events should be understood in dialogue with one another. And for those who may not know, the Nakba is the Arabic term that Palestinians use, which means the catastrophe, to describe the destruction of Palestine and 7 decades of displacement, dispossession, and disenfranchisement of the Palestinian people, which continues through the present. And so much of Israel's moral legitimacy as a state in its establishment is derived from the Holocaust and the events of the Holocaust. So what we found, which was really inspiring in our research, is that almost universally among our German, Israeli, and Palestinian interviewees, there was a real consciousness and cognizance of the Holocaust, its importance, its profound nature, its tragedy, one of the world's most devastating genocides, and a real reckoning with that, even in the present. But what we found overwhelmingly is that, particularly among our German interlocutors, the term Nakba was not even recognized or legible. There was very, very little consciousness of the Nakba, and this we found to be actually quite heartbreaking. So ultimately, one of our main messages in the book or calls is that this compassion that's extended towards Israelis in contemporary Berlin is incredibly inspiring and is to be lauded, but that compassion should also be extended to Palestinians as well.
Mm-hmm. I want to just quickly go back to this for one moment, because the term may not be familiar, but did you also find that the event, I mean, that what happened, that people didn't know what happened? Or, I mean, the term is also not that familiar elsewhere, right? I think I would wonder, do we distinguish between those two?
I think that's very insightful, that just because people may not be familiar with the term doesn't necessarily mean that they're totally unfamiliar with a set of historical events surrounding the Nakba. But at the same time, given that this is such a robust Palestinian diaspora community, as Kati mentioned, and that Berlin really is home to the largest Palestinian diaspora community in Europe, and given where Palestinians fit in this moral triangle that connects Israelis, Germans, and Palestinians so intimately, that one would hope eventually we could get to a point, especially if we truly want to build restorative justice between these three communities, that term, that concept is tremendously important, and we hope that we can move in that direction as well.
Thank you. Yeah, we need to get into the restorative justice piece, but before we do what about the role of religion? I mean, you know, just yesterday, I think I saw in the German paper that the Catholic Church in Germany has catastrophic loss of membership, that that people are leaving the church in droves. And so there's clearly a story of secularization on the part of the Christian German Europeans. And I wonder, what role does religion play in this triangle? Are there any self-described religious actors, or is it all a story of secularization?
So we actually do not focus that much on religion in our manuscript, but would certainly be one of the numerous points which would deserve to be dealt with in more depth. Berlin is actually sometimes called the atheist capital of Europe, as 64% of Berlin's residents have no registered religious affiliation. That said, most households who live in Berlin are religious, and but while we do refer to some of the mosques which have a significant percentage of Palestinian worshippers among their members, there are no mosques that are exclusively for Palestinians. And though most Israelis who come to Berlin identify as Jews, the majority of those who are in Berlin are actually secular. There's a small religious minority, but it's really a small cohort.
Mm-hmm.
So, but religion, of course, does play a role for all or most of the individuals we write about in our book, even those who are not practicing or who are secular. As Jews are largely considered a minority in Germany that is very much valued, respected, and also protected. And Muslims instead, and Palestinians are, of course, the majority among them are Muslims, but in general, Muslims are mostly discriminated upon and also marginalized. We do write about our visit at the Frankelufer Synagogue during Shabbat service, which is actually the most popular synagogue among all the synagogues that exist in Berlin with the Israeli population. But even on a Shabbat service, among the 20 or so worshippers, there were only 3 Israelis, one being myself. And but despite the relatively small group of people who attended the service, there was a lot of security outside, private security, and also German police. And when we visited the Dar es Salaam Mosque for a Friday prayer that included hundreds of worshippers, there was, of course, no security present.
Mm-hmm. So I want to get back to the triangle. And the which I understand Daniel Barenboim, you quote Daniel Barenboim also in the book, who says, you know, the Germans have done a lot with respect to the Holocaust, but they have not really assumed their responsibility towards the Palestinians, even though there's a clear connection between the German Holocaust and the plight of the Palestinians. And you create this triangle, but isn't the moral issue a more complex issue that involves others, like the British, like the United States, and other Arab nations as well? So shouldn't it be a bigger form, maybe a pentagon or something even more complex?
You know what? So the image of the triangle is figurative. We're not referring to an actual literal triangle. And I love your imagination, Sabina, and I love your flirting with the idea of using different kinds of shapes and expanding the set of actors. And absolutely, the British colonialism has played a role in this conflict, in this drama, in this saga. Surrounding Arab states have played significant problems. You know, I don't think they've been productive in many ways, especially with how they've treated Palestinian refugees in their borders, etc. But at the end of the day, the Holocaust, is in many ways, a German Jewish issue, even though there are other victims of the Holocaust as well. We can talk about LGBTQ people. We can talk about different populations that were targeted in the Holocaust. So maybe they should belong somewhere in the shape as well, those other populations. And similarly, the surrounding Arab nations or the British, we could feature them here. But at the end of the day, when we think about Holocaust trauma, most of the Jewish victims of the Holocaust trace that to an original source of Germany. And Palestinians, regardless of where they live in refugee communities or the diaspora, regardless of how maybe mistreated they could be in a country like Lebanon, etc., at the end of the day, ultimately, they trace their trauma back to Israel and historic Palestine. And as a result, we think that this triangle is productive as a metaphor. But we're very, very, very open to expanding the shapes, and we try to do as much as we could in the context of one very ambitious book.
And it certainly convinced me, and I have to say, this is I guess a very convincing explanation. I think in addition to that, you also provide a sense of hope in the book, and the hope, I assume, lies in the triangle, because you are seeing this Middle East conflict, as we call it, becoming more open for actual new conversations, for new connections, for new ways of talking to each other and dealing with things. And it's almost like taking it out of its crunch and opening it up that way. And so, maybe there's a call on your part towards Germany to take initiative in a way that hasn't been utilized, and use this opportunity. I mean, it is, in my eyes, as I read your book, an amazing opportunity that hasn't really been dealt with. But anyway, I want to get to another question that Shaina proposed that I think is really key also in your book. And that is about gender. There are women in hijabs and men in kippot, marking the body as a certain type of subject. What gender dynamics did you come across in your research? I mean, you have these wonderful interviews, although the large majority of people were not willing to reveal their names, right? And I would love to hear more about that. But was there a gendered dynamic as well, Katja, maybe?
Well, even though gender is very much at the focus of our research in general, Saed just published this book on queer Palestine, and I'm working on a book on Jewish women. It was not really the focus of our study, and you could turn it into a focus and write another book. There's actually an Israeli scholar who wrote a book on queer Israelis in Berlin, or in Berlin and a couple of other cities. Hila
Amit, A-M-I-T.
Right. But we do come across certain gender sensitive issues, of course. So we have found something that we experienced as we conducted the interviews, but something that we were then also able to support with statistics, which is that women wearing the hijab are very often attacked. There's a lot of violence against Muslims, mosques, Muslims in general, but mostly women wearing the hijab. And this is something that is not highlighted in the media or documented. In contrast, there are of course far fewer incidents with Jews who wear the kippah. First of all, there are very few Jews who are Orthodox who live in Berlin, and there are far fewer Jews and religious practicing Jews than Muslims. So it's a little difficult and delicate to bring those two into dialogue. But in general, because of the history, whenever someone who wears a kippah experiences harassment or violence, this is highlighted in the media. And there was actually one incident that happened right when we were conducting our field study, a very awkward situation where a Palestinian who was wearing, a Palestinian with Israeli citizenship, he was wearing a kippah, went out into the street and was attacked by another Palestinian who came from Syria. And coincidentally, an Israeli tourist who was visiting Berlin that day captured this on his iPhone, and then it went viral on social media, in the media. The Palestinian was convicted, put into jail, and there was a whole upheaval, not only in Berlin, but throughout Germany, and people started to organize marches and protests and wearing the kippah. In fact, Berlin's mayor, Michael Müller, came out and stated on the news, "Today we all wear kippah. Heute tragen wir alle kippah." And so we were there while this happened. And it was, I must say personally, I found it was very awkward to see all these Germans wearing a kippah, men and women, and some of them wore a talit, a prayer shawl, and it made me feel really uncomfortable. It was really, really strange. Of course, I want Germans to be sensitive to religious diversity, and but it was a very awkward situation. There's perhaps one more thing that I want to mention here, which is almost personal, which actually emerges and comes up in the postscript, something that Saed often shared with me as we were conducting the field study and as we were spending time together in Berlin, which is that he had never experienced being embraced as a gay man anywhere in the world as much as in Berlin, more so than in San Francisco or Provincetown or Miami. He really, I mean, it would be better if he told you that, but I'm going to tell this from my perspective now, that it really touched me. On the other hand, he not only felt rejected, but he was rejected in Germany, and I mean, Palestinians very often feel that and experience that, and there are all different kinds of restrictions on speech, on expressing opinions when it comes to the Israel-Palestine conflict. So there was this contradiction that Saed experienced very intensely, and I with him, being spending a lot of time during the course of our research with him. And of course, the book is full of contradictions. There are a lot of issues that are very contradictory that we examine in the book, but that was one of them.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And we have time for one more question before we open up to the audience. So I want to get to the issue of restorative justice, which is, of course, a huge undertaking coming from South Africa, and a really ambitious idea. So the question is, do you see this as a personal process, as a communal one, as one that the government initiates? Is it a distinctly urban one that can take place in a city like Berlin, where people, as you said, go to escape their demons? Or is it something that happens through the arts, maybe like Yael Ronen or Youssef Soued? Who is able to engage in this, and how would it have to get started?
Well, we are very hopeful that Berlin provides a model for restorative justice. I think we here in the US could learn a lot from Germany in terms of taking ownership of the past and this robust understanding of moral responsibility. And we actually see that this moral triangle in Berlin also gives us hope for what the future of Israel-Palestine can look like. Berlin provides a kind of space for Israelis and Palestinians and Germans to interact in a way that we hope ultimately, once the conflict is over and the occupation is over in Palestine, Israelis and Palestinians can adopt that model as well. But I think there's a role for everyone. There's a role for the arts. We think there's a role for the state, for civil society. There's a role at the grassroots level to work towards restorative justice. And I think the last thing I'll say is that we're very heavily influenced by the work of Michael Rothberg, who's a professor of Holocaust studies at UCLA, who published a seminal book on multi-directional memory, where he juxtaposes competitive memory versus multi-directional memory. And he says that we need to move towards a multi-directional model where we understand that recognition of the other's suffering and trauma, or other people's suffering and trauma, does not necessarily take away from recognition of our own. And that actually, when we recognize each other's trauma and suffering, we expand more space in the public domain for recognizing all of our humanity and transcending those wounds moving forward. So we do try to end on a hopeful note. Thank you, Sabina.
Thank you.
I will just add a couple of words about, you asked about Yael Ronen and Youssef Soueid, and maybe something more general about the art. So I would say that we see a lot more intersections of Israelis and Palestinians within the art world than otherwise. There's also some intersection or working together and socializing in academia and among intellectuals, and to some extent also in business. But we felt that there are actually quite a number of art projects that deal specifically with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and of course Yael Ronen plays that are performed in one of the main theaters in Berlin deal specifically with the triangle. And since we opened with saying that there is no scholarship or no other book that has brought these two communities into dialogue, there's actually a very significant art project that does bring these three communities into dialogue. And we open our book with Yael Ronen, and we end our book with reference to her work. And so maybe I tell very quickly the story that she wrote this piece called Third Generation, a play that was supposed to be performed at Israel's National Theater, Habima in Tel Aviv, and the government tried to prevent it from being staged. And it was then nevertheless performed, and that actually started her international career big time. She moved to Berlin, and it's now performed all over the world. She has in the meantime also written another play that again brings these three communities into dialogue, Germans, Israelis, and Palestinians, called The Situation. And Saed and I went to her play. We spoke to her. We met the actors who include Germans, Israelis, Palestinians, speaking on the stage in Hebrew, German, English, and Arabic. And it touches precisely on the issues that we engage in the book, just from a different perspective, and dealing with it, obviously not from an academic, on an academic level, but so just one example from the arts, but there's a lot of interesting stuff happening in Berlin that we don't see in any other city.
Thank you.
Everyone, I am Shana Weiss. I am the Associate Director here at the Schusterman Center. I again want to thank everyone for this really special event. There are amazing questions coming in. I will not get to all of them, but I'm going to try and include a couple. There's a couple of questions about the rise of right-wing extremism in Germany and how the different communities have reacted, both the Jewish community and the Palestinian community. And I know we spoke about it a little bit with the kippah protests, and I have to say, as a Jewish woman who does not wear a kippah in her religious practices, there's weird gender politics there, which is why I actually put that question in. But what has this conversation been like about this sort of right-wing extremism in Germany and the two communities, and how have the different communities reacted to it?
Shall I answer this question quickly?
Sure. Sure.
So it's actually very interesting because I'm sorry, I forgot the question.
About the responses and concerns about growing right-wing extremism.
Oh yes, so this is one of the other extreme, one of these situations where we see both extremes, specifically in Berlin, more so than in any other city in Germany. So you have this welcoming culture, and Germans participating in helping migrant communities to settle, to be absorbed into Germany. I mean, there are people who donate money, others donate clothes, others teach them German, others volunteer to show them Germany. I mean, there's so many efforts, so many initiatives, and we have actually encountered a good number of Germans, Israelis, and Palestinians who participate in these initiatives. And we're, of course, deeply touched by those gestures of welcoming and trying to integrate these different communities, mostly from Syria. During the summer of 2015, nearly 1 million immigrants arrived. Refugees arrived in Germany, 270,000 of whom settled directly in Berlin. On the other hand, you have this other extreme. You have the, in 2017, so really just a month before we conducted our field study, the AfD, the Alternative for Germany, openly right-wing political party, entered into the German parliament. It had a significant presence of almost 20% of the seats. Very, very alarming. And this was actually the first time an openly right-wing xenophobic party entered into the German parliament after World War II. And so you have that presence too. And we did have the opportunity to interview some AfD supporters, and we really heard some shocking anti-Semitic, Islamophobic remarks, and including when the person we spoke to knew that I was Jewish and Saed is Palestinian.
Thank you. Saed, do you want to add anything to that? Or okay, just want to make sure. There are questions, and I know the book discusses it, about dialogue groups and some of their experiences in Germany between Israelis and Palestinians, between Jews and Palestinians and other parts of the Arab community. So I was wondering if maybe Saad, you could speak to those dialogue groups, how they function, and sort of how they fit into the larger analysis that you've created.
Thanks, Jane. No, we have a whole chapter called Points of Intersection, which is actually one of my favorite chapters. And I hope that folks might consider giving that chapter a read or a skim. I know people are busy, but just one example that's really inspiring. And we were talking about him right before our webinar went live. Armin Langer, Rabbi Armin Langer, who's training to be a rabbi and who is a remarkable human being who we interviewed in Berlin. And he is a co-founder of the Salam Shalom initiative in Berlin, which actually brings together Jewish individuals as well as Muslim individuals, which includes Israelis and Palestinians, and they come together for interfaith dialogue. They come together for joint activism combating both anti-Semitism and Islamophobia in contemporary German society. And they have campaigns responding to, for example, all of the discourse surrounding the kippah or the hijab. So they do some really inspiring work, and we give other examples in that chapter.
Thank you. There were also questions about how the Jewish community in Berlin, let's say the non-Israeli Jewish community, are they involved in this at all? What is their reaction to these, to these populations, right? What's their role in all of this?
Yeah, that's actually a very good question. It's actually very surprising, but the Israeli community and the Jewish community don't interact or hardly interact. They're pretty separate. Now, the Jewish community is about 80% of Russian background. They tend to be relatively right-wing politically, pro-Netanyahu. And it is actually very strange because they're so pro-Israel, yet they have this huge Israeli community in Tel Aviv, but they actually don't engage with them, and they don't even agree with them. They don't, I wouldn't say they don't like them, they don't know enough about them, but these Israelis are actually, for the most part, very left-wing and critical of their government. And so there are some clashes, not direct clashes between these two communities, but there are very often in the public or political realm, there is some kind of conflict, because a lot of the policies in Germany that decides, for example, public appearances of intellectuals or artists who are critical of Israel, which the majority of the Israelis support, and then the German Jews very often push to restrict those kinds of events, and are very vocal in this opinion that if you criticize Israel, you are anti-Semite. And so a lot of these Israelis are now being attacked by their Jewish neighbors as being anti-Semitic because they're critical, even though they tend to be much more educated with regard to Judaism, with regard to the Israel-Palestine conflict, but their most fearful judges are the Jewish community in Berlin. So it's an excellent question, and we were really stunned to learn about how they lived together and yet very much apart in this city.
It's probably important to add that over 90% of them are Russian origin, right?
Yes, Katerina
very
mentioned.
young. Yeah.
Yeah, and so there's a lot of competing diasporas here.
90 or 80%, I don't remember. I think
it's a very high percentage. I don't remember exactly, but most of those of you who don't know, most of the Jewish community in Berlin now are Russian-speaking Jews who immigrated from the former Soviet Union, either directly to Berlin or Germany or via Israel or other countries.
Right. That's actually true for most of Germany.
And you're right, it's true for most of Germany as well. We have 2 minutes left, but I do want to ask a really good question that came in. And, we talked about some extreme right-wing, political movements, and I don't want to, this is not equating them, obviously, but I also am curious about some of the movements on the left, the anti-Deutsch movement, and some of the more radical thinking among Berlin and how these communities fit into that. And with maybe 30 seconds each, if you could say something about that.
I could just say quickly that, generally speaking, when we think about progressive left camps, political camps around the world, solidarity with Palestinians is becoming a salient domain. This commitment to Palestinian human rights, we see this in so many different parts of the world. But Berlin and Germany are an exception, which is really fascinating, that even this unites right, center, and even the most left political parties, as well as formal public discourse on these issues, where a lot of people will even identify as pro, not only Israel, but even pro Netanyahu. So it's this fascinating situation where you have Germans who are progressive on so many issues, but when it comes to this issue, they're actually aligning themselves with the Netanyahu government. It's quite a fascinating set of circumstances.
Well, thank you all so much. Thank you to Saad, to Katerina, to Sabina. Thank you to all of you who attended. I encourage you to check out the websites of the Center for German and European Studies at Brandeis, to check out our website, the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies, and have a wonderful day. Thank you all so much.
Thank you for making it happen.
It was lovely to be there.
Thank you all, and thank you, Sabina. Thank you, Shana. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you all.
And thank you, Anna, our tech guru.